Hi. Thank you for watching the video till the end. My goal is to reach 1,000 subscribers on my YouTube channel. If you're interested in this type of content, please subscribe. I would be grateful to you. Let's move on to the story. Story 1: Dark Memories. John and Sarah Miller moved into a new house in the small town of Maplewood, Vermont, hoping to leave behind their hectic city life and start fresh. The house was cozy, standing at the edge of a forest, and seemed like the perfect place to raise their 2-year-old son, Tim. However, since moving in, Sarah couldn't shake the strange feeling that someone was watching them. On the first night after the move, she had a nightmare in which a stranger stood in the corner of their bedroom, watching them. John reassured her, saying it was just the stress of the move. A few weeks passed, and life in Maplewood seemed peaceful. However, Sarah continued to feel uneasy. One evening when John was late at work, Sarah heard the creaking of floorboards downstairs. She grabbed a flashlight and went to check. Finding nothing suspicious, she returned to bed, telling herself it was just old wood settling. But the next morning, she noticed one of the window sashes on the first floor was slightly open. She remembered closing all the windows before bed. One Friday, John came home later than usual. He opened the door and immediately sensed something was wrong. The house was quiet, too quiet. He called out for Sarah, but there was no response. Growing anxious, he searched the entire house and discovered that Sarah and Tim were missing. Panic gripped him, and he immediately called the police. Officers arrived quickly and began an investigation. There were no signs of a struggle in the house. On the living room table was a note that read, "You shouldn't have moved here." John was terrified, not understanding what was happening. The police launched a thorough investigation. They questioned neighbors, but no one had seen anything suspicious. Investigators found several fingerprints in the house that didn't belong to John or Sarah. The prints were sent to a forensic lab for analysis. A few days later, the results came back. The fingerprints belonged to a man named Michael Hartman. His name was already associated with several disappearances and murders in other states. Hartman was a skilled maniac who carefully selected his victims and watched them for weeks before striking. 2 weeks passed since Sarah and Tim's disappearance. John was on the brink of a nervous breakdown. One morning, he received a letter in the mail with no return address. Inside was just a single piece of paper with coordinates written on it. John immediately handed the letter to the police. When officers arrived at the coordinates, they found an old abandoned shed in the woods. Inside, they found the bodies of Sarah and Tim. Their deaths had been brutal and torturous. Sarah was tied up and beaten, and Tim had been strangled. On the shed wall, written in blood, were the words, "This is not the end." John was completely broken. His world had collapsed, and he couldn't cope with the loss. The police continued their hunt for Michael Hartman, but he seemed to have vanished. He couldn't be found in any of the states. Soon, the case was closed due to lack of new evidence. John sold the house and moved away, hoping to find some solace elsewhere. But the nightmares haunted him, forcing him to relive the terrible moment he found his loved ones' bodies. Years passed, but Michael Hartman was never caught. He became a legend among locals, embodying the evil that could strike at any moment. John Miller remained forever a man who had lost everything dear to him. His life turned into a constant flight from his own nightmares, from which he could find no escape. Hartman's shadow loomed over the town, reminding everyone that even in the quietest and safest places, evil could find its way, and no one knew when or where he would strike next. Story 2: Silent Horror. Emily and Michael Harper moved into an old Victorian house in the small town of Granite Falls, Colorado, to escape the hustle and bustle of the city and start anew. They hoped that the quiet suburb would be the perfect place for their children, Claire and Jake, to grow and learn. The house, surrounded by a forest, seemed cozy and safe, but from the first day, Emily couldn't shake the feeling that someone or something was watching them. It all started with small things. Emily noticed that items in the house were being moved. She often found windows and doors open that she was sure she had closed. One night when Michael was on a business trip, Emily heard strange noises coming from the basement. She took a flashlight and went down to check, but found nothing except cold, damp air and dark corners. Weeks passed, and the tension grew. Emily started seeing shadows flitting past windows. She told Michael about her fears, but he dismissed them, attributing everything to stress from the move and fatigue. However, one night, when everyone was asleep, Jake, their 6-year-old son, woke his parents, saying that there was someone in his room. Michael checked the entire room but found no one. He reassured Jake and went back to bed. The next morning, Emily found a note on the kitchen table. Written in a shaky hand, "You shouldn't be here." She showed the note to Michael, and he finally decided to call the police. The police conducted an inspection of the house but found nothing suspicious. They suggested that the note might have been left by some pranksters. However, Emily felt that the matter was much more serious. She insisted on installing a security system and replacing all the locks in the house. While the cameras were being installed, they temporarily moved in with friends in a neighboring town. A few days after returning home, Emily decided to check the footage from the cameras. She was fast-forwarding through the video when she noticed something strange. On one of the night recordings, a shadow appeared in the hallway and disappeared into one of the rooms. Emily was horrified. She showed the recording to Michael, and they decided they could no longer stay in that house. However, when they tried to leave, the car wouldn't start. Fear gripped them. Suddenly, they heard a knock on the door. Michael cautiously approached the door and looked through the peephole but saw no one. When he opened the door, there was another note on the doorstep, "Too late." That night, they couldn't sleep. Emily heard heavy footsteps approaching their bedroom. She grabbed her phone, but found that the line was cut. The door slowly opened, and a tall man with a knife in hand entered the room. It was Peter Vincent, a notorious maniac who had been evading the police for several years. Michael tried to protect his family, but Peter was too strong. He stabbed Michael, who fell to the floor. Emily screamed, begging Peter to spare the children. But he seemed to enjoy their fear. Peter tied up Emily and the children, forcing them to watch as he tortured Michael. In the morning, neighbors called the police, having heard the screams and noises from the Harper house. When officers arrived, they found a horrifying scene. Michael lay dead in a pool of blood. Emily and the children were tied up and unable to speak from shock. Peter Vincent had disappeared, leaving behind only bloody traces and another note, "This is just the beginning." Emily and her children were deeply traumatized by what had happened. They moved out of town, trying to start a new life, but the horror of those nights haunted them. Peter Vincent was never caught, and his name became synonymous with terror in Granite Falls. People in the town became more vigilant, fearing that the maniac might return at any moment. The story of the Harpers remained a chilling reminder that evil could penetrate even the quietest and safest places. No one knew when or where Peter Vincent would strike next. Story 3: Death Comes at Night. In the quiet town of Cypress Hills, Texas, lived the young Smith family. Tom and Linda had recently bought a house surrounded by dense forest. With them were their children, 8-year-old Annie and 5-year-old Ben. Life seemed peaceful, but Linda had a constant feeling that someone was watching them. She tried not to give it much thought, but the feeling of unease never left her. A few months passed since the move. One evening when Tom was late at work, Linda heard quiet footsteps in the house. She was sure she had closed all the doors and windows. Checking the house, she found nothing suspicious, but her heart was racing. The next day, she found a small note on the kitchen table with the words. Soon Linda showed the note to Tom, but he just laughed it off, thinking it was a child's prank. However, strange events continued. Linda started finding things moved around the house and heard rustling behind the walls. One night, Ben woke up screaming, claiming there was a bad man in his room. Tom again reassured everyone, saying it was just childhood fears. Soon after, Linda found fresh, muddy footprints on the bedroom windowsill. She knew she had closed the windows that night, and it couldn't have been a random passerby. Tom finally decided to install security cameras around the house. The cameras captured every movement around the house. A few days later, reviewing the footage, Tom and Linda saw something horrifying. On one of the night recordings, a man in a mask slowly approached the house and stood by the bedroom window, watching the sleeping family. They were shocked and immediately called the police. Officers arrived and began an investigation but found no trace of the stranger. The police advised the family to be cautious and not to go outside at night. The Smiths were scared but hoped it was a one-time incident. Weeks passed, and life seemed to return to normal. One night, When the children were already asleep, Linda heard a knock at the door. She looked through the peephole but saw only darkness. Suddenly, the windows began to rattle as if someone was trying to break in. Tom grabbed a baseball bat and went to check the house. Meanwhile, Linda tried to call the police but found the phone line had been cut. Tom checked the entire house but found no one. Returning to the bedroom, he found another note on the bed, "I am already here." That night, they couldn't sleep. Tom kept the bat close, and Linda stayed with the children in one room, trying to calm them. Suddenly, they heard someone trying to open the front door. Tom slowly approached the door and opened it sharply, ready to defend himself. Standing at the threshold was a tall man in dirty clothes with a knife in his hand. It was James McPherson, an escaped psychopath who had fled prison months earlier. Tom tried to fight back, but James was stronger. He stabbed Tom and entered the house. Linda screamed, shielding the children. James slowly approached them, savoring their fear. He grabbed Linda and tied her up, then turned to the children. The police arrived too late. They found the house in a state of chaos, signs of struggle, blood, and screams. Tom lay dead at the front door, Linda was tied up and unconscious, and the children were nowhere to be found. The entire town was in shock from what had happened. The next morning, the bodies of Annie and Ben were found in the nearby woods. James McPherson had disappeared again, leaving behind only fear and pain. The town was gripped by terror. Residents began to fear going out at night, worried he might return. Linda survived the tragedy, but her life was shattered. She could no longer return to the house where she lost her family. Moving in with relatives, she tried to start a new life, but the memories of that terrible night haunted her every day. James McPherson was never caught, and his name became a symbol of fear in Cypress Hills. This story became a reminder to everyone that evil could come unexpectedly, disrupting the most peaceful and happy life. The town lived in constant fear, anticipating that the maniac might strike again. And no one knew when and where it would happen.